C.K. Prahlad Memorial Lecture being organized by the Ananta Aspen Center and the CII. The Ananta Aspen Center, as many of you might be aware, is a leading think tank in India, headquartered in Delhi, of course, has a very strong branch in India, in Calcutta. Vitoshri represents the Ananta Aspen Center in Calcutta, and it has been instrumental in leading, along with CII, a large number of strategic dialogue, the track to dialogues with various countries. It's been also involved in a large number of leadership training programs with various sections of the society, including IFS officers, people from the industry, training them on leadership. So it's quite apt that we are able to do this memorial lecture at the CII Suresh Neotia Center of Excellence on Leadership. I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the C.K. Prahlad Memorial Lecture and why we started that. And actually, all of you, I assume, would know Professor C.K. Prahlad, who has been an outstanding professor in the Michigan, in the University of Michigan, as a full distinguished professor. And he had actually been interacting with CII for quite a while in the early 2000s. And it was in 2007 that CII was celebrating India at 60, the 60th year of India's independence. And at that point in time, when we were in New York talking about India at 60, he talked about, well, let's not look behind for the last 60 years, but let's look ahead and talk about India as it would be in 2022, when India will be 75 years of independence. So it was from there he picked up a lot of vision for India. He spoke about that India should have 200 million trained graduates. He talked about 500 million skilled people. He talked about 500 new cities in India. He talked about that at least 30 of the Fortune 100 firms should be from India. He talked about the number of Nobel laureates that India could get into. And it was with all those areas of work that he sort of visioned for India, that we had a visioning exercise with a large number of chief ministers and various people from the industry. And we did a visioning exercise of what India at 75 can truly achieve in 15 years' time from when India was 60 to India at 75. And that's one visioning exercise which was started with CII, and CII sort of internalized it and called it an India at 75. Today we have an India at 75 Trust, which is chaired by Mr. Adi Godrej, and we felt that we can, and we have involved the government. We see a large number of those visions that Professor C.K. Prahlad mentioned and worked with us till 2010 when he passed away. He sort of helped us institutionalize not only in CII but in the government. We have seen many of those programs which has been talked about with different names could be in the government structure. So it was with that background that we started after his passing away in 2010. C.K. Prahlad Memorial Lecture, and this is the fifth in the row, and we have invited here Dr. Naushad Forbes. Dr. Naushad Forbes this year is the president of CII, and he has been very strong. He has been himself been closely associated with Professor C.K. Prahlad at several points in time, and he himself has been educated also in the United States. He has been an alumni of the Stanford University. He taught in the Stanford University for quite a period of time, after which he focused more on his business and started going to Stanford to teach less and less, and now almost doesn't go at all, other than doing some conferences with the Stanford. And so it's great to have Dr. Naushad Forbes to give this fifth memorial lecture. And I must say that while he has been associated with CII quite a lot, Naushad has also been a person who's been closely associated with CII in the areas of innovation, in the areas of technology, in the areas of education. And these are three areas where he has given phenomenal leadership to CII And today, therefore, it's good that he's talking about growth through innovations, a subject which he sort of really understands and masters. And we are happy to really have this at the Suresh Neotia Center of Excellence, which is chaired by Sri Harsh Neotia. And I must again say that the support that we have received from Harsh Neotia in terms of getting this center activated over the last few years has been tremendous. And this center, which has been named after Mr. Suresh Neotia, is a very proud center of leadership for CII. We have 9 centers of excellence across the country, and we felt that the best place to locate a center on leadership would be in Calcutta, and it was with that we had approached the Neotia family, and they were so forthcoming in saying that they would promote and sponsor such a marvelous center that we have been able to build under their patronage. So that's the background, and it's a great pleasure in welcoming all of you once again, and thank you very much for being here for this very important and significant lecture. Good evening, and thank you very much once again.
Dr. Naushad Forbes, Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee, distinguished members of the audience, ladies and gentlemen. It is truly a great honor and privilege to host the C.K. Prahlad Memorial Lecture at the CII Suresh Neotia Center for Excellence in Leadership. And really a special privilege to have Dr. Naushad Forbes. As you've just heard, he is an alumni of the Stanford University, but more importantly, has led many innovation missions, has even taught at Stanford. Very rarely do you get a high-ranking business leader who has also been a lecturer and teacher. And we have this wonderful combination of a leader of Indian industry and an academic to share light on a subject that is of very great importance to us here in India, innovation. On a lighter note, the president of CII and the president of FICCI very rarely share a podium together. Well, we do, only when there is a head of state present. And there is a head of state present. So I was just about to say that, Chandrajit, today you are officiating as a head of state. Anyway, CII is a state and he is the head of CII, so in that sense it's not too much. But here I am, of course, today here in the capacity as chairing this center. And well, the center was set up a few years ago basically with an idea to look at how leadership could be promoted, developed, encouraged, not just in the field of business, but in every aspect of life. We do various programs with government officials, with NGOs, with students, with, of course, entrepreneurs, to see how we can learn from each other and grow the ecosystem of leadership in the country. And therefore, innovation and leadership definitely is a very important issue. So even from the center's point of view, the subject today of innovation is very important. Leadership is evolving, the nature of leadership is evolving as the challenges in the world change. Of course, there's some quintessential truths about leadership which will perhaps remain ever relevant, but the times change and therefore ideas change, and I think it would be wonderful to see how we can look at innovation even in the field of leadership. As was wonderfully said by Albert Einstein once, if you always do what you always did, you will always get what you always got. And therefore, it becomes even more important. The world economy has remained predominantly unstable since the last economic downturn in 2008, and the crisis is certainly not over. Tackling this sustained volatility in the market requires some kind of special and innovative solutions, which necessitates focus beyond the traditional innovation matrix of industrial growth. The 5th C.K. Prahlad Memorial Lecture on the topic comes at a time when the Global Innovation Index 2016 has just been released at a function hosted by CII, NITI Aayog and the Department of Industrial Policy Promotion. It was heartening to note that India has leapfrogged 15 positions in innovation to reach the 66th position this year, a really commendable feat. This shows the inherent strength of the economy and how the measures taken by the government, industry and academia are actually taking effect in reality. In today's world, businesses have only two choices, innovate or perish. Let me share with you some facts. Only 12% of Fortune 500 companies in 1955 were still on the list 60 years later in 2015. And nearly 88% of the companies from that period have gone bankrupt or have merged with other firms. So innovation is something which unites the whole of mankind, and interesting thing about it is that it just starts with an idea. No matter how small, we need to nurture new thoughts and allow them to grow. An intangible part of innovation and its commercialization is the courage to take risks. The greater the innovation, the higher the risk of converting it into a commercialized product or process. Governments in developed countries have a range of instruments to stimulate individuals and firms to invest more for innovation and to become risk takers. The Government of India is also kindling such initiatives through the initiatives of the Startup India and Skill India and the Atal Innovation Mission. Professionally, dealing with innovation as a process to convert ideas into commercial products is an art that India is gradually imbibing. At the Suresh Neotia Center of Excellence, this has emerged as a guiding philosophy, and we aim to enable smaller enterprises to scale up and grow. It is from this growth that we can create employment and generate income. In spite of many challenges, I am confident that the momentum will only grow and with strength and help India to be a world leader in the next decade. Let me once again welcome all of you to this C.K. Prahlad Memorial Lecture by Dr. Naushad Forbes, and I request you to please welcome him with loud acclamation.
Very rarely do I have to pull the mics down when I get up to speak. We'll also sit there, fine. Good idea. So I've actually requested Chandrajit to tell me when, I'm told that in the program I have half an hour for this, but I asked Chandrajit to tell me and signal when I cross between 15 and 20 minutes, so that, because my hope is to actually stop earlier so we have more time for questions and discussion. Okay, so it's a privilege to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a privilege to be here. Thank you, Harsh, very much for being here, for coming back from Delhi early to be with us this evening. So Harsh, Rajiv, Chandrajit, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. It's a privilege to be giving this lecture because C.K. Prahlad really inspired us all. He inspired us to dream big. And as Chandrajit mentioned earlier on, his lecture on India at 75 directly led to the India at 75 institution that we've been building over the last few years. As you know, Professor Prahlad saw a developed India by 2022, and this developed India would come from, among other things, it would come from three things that are my concern this evening. It would come from growth, in particular growth in manufacturing and in the modern manufacturing sector. It would come from innovation. It was a very focused and specific part of his landmark India at 75 speech. And it would come from building many Indian multinationals along the way. And that will also be a part of what I will be talking about this evening. So this talk on growth through innovation is really in that spirit. And as I said, it's a privilege to be doing it. And I'd like to thank the Ananta Aspen Center for inviting me to give it, and the CII Suresh Neotia Center and Harsh for hosting it here. So let me set the context for this talk with a perspective of where we are 25 years after reforms began, and to use that perspective to make a proposition. So where are we 25 years after reforms began? And I think we take some of these things for granted today, but it's good to think back over time, to think back 25 years. And if I was trying to think about my own situation 25 years ago in the country. I say 25 years ago, as an affluent Indian, I just bought a new car, which was only a 10-year-old model at that point in time, globally, replacing a 25-year-old model new car that I had earlier. I used to get many of my clothes overseas. Today, all our cars are the latest models internationally. I used to get most of my clothes overseas, or many of them overseas. Today, I get everything in India. I sort of live as an individual on processed cheese, and I used to really have difficulty finding good sources of good quality cheese in the country. Today, I can get it in 10 stores within walking distance of where I live in Pune. We used to book, if you remember at that time, phone lines 5 years ahead of when we needed them. I remember my first visit to our office in Calcutta. We were having a meeting in the office, and the phone rang, and there was this cheer from the whole group there. I couldn't figure this out, what happened, why the cheer? Well, it was the first time the phone had rung in 9 months. So there was this was normal life. This was the way in which we lived in that pre-reform era. And I mean, if you remember, television at that time consisted of Doordarshan, where you could choose between the news and a program on animal husbandry. So not very exciting at the end of the day. And all of that has changed. And today, all of this is on a par with any international city. Any international city provides you with all of these benefits, all of this access, and we have it too. So, and today, by the way, when you take a flight from London or New York to Bombay or Delhi, you get the distinct impression that you're leaving a third world country and arriving in a first world one. So we've had transformed product and service markets with all of the transformed industry that has gone with these transformed product and service markets. Let me set up another construct, if you like. We have many today growing multinationals with Indian roots. The Tata Group certainly, with Tata Motors, Tata Steel, Tata Chemicals, Tata Tea, Mahindra and Mahindra, the many IT service businesses that now operate around the world and get almost all of their business from outside of India. The big pharmaceutical success stories of the last 25 years, like DRL or Sun Pharma, or earlier Ranbaxy, or Biocon or Cipla. So a lot of change. But you know all of this, so why am I telling you all this? Well, it's a familiar story, right? But I think the reason I'm mentioning all this is because I want to set all of this dramatic change in our product and service markets against things which have not changed or have changed much less. So what has not changed that much? First of all, the share of industry and manufacturing in GDP is much the same today as it was in 1991. If you look at the share of manufacturing in GDP, it's about 15% now. It was about 15% in 1991. Right? Other structural changes taken place. In particular, the service sector has grown and the agricultural share has dropped, but the manufacturing share has stayed about the same. And this is in spite of all the talk by the previous government, the present government, and if I may say so, all of us in both FICCI and CII, right? So that's stayed much the same. Even more, the growth of industry has not apparently I'm saying, been accompanied by growth in jobs in manufacturing, or at least not been accompanied by growth in formal sector jobs. So we have no example of a Foxconn plant here. Foxconn makes things like iPhones. It's a contract manufacturer, which employs 1.4 million people in China. It's a Taiwanese firm employing 1.4 million people in mainland China. Their largest single plant employs 400,000 people in one factory, if you think of it. Set that against just under 7 million people employed in India's total formal manufacturing sector. So one plant, 400,000 people. And this plant has a turnover rate, a labor turnover rate of 19% a month, right? 19% a month, which says that 80,000 people a month get a better job, right? I mean, you could talk about how this 19% turnover rate is terrible, but what it actually means is that 80,000 people leave that factory each month because they can get a better job. And that's the kind of very dynamic, manufacturing intensive employment creation that is a model we do not have in the country. So while our product and service markets have been transformed, I'm going to argue that our innovation system has not been transformed. We have a few companies that are honorable exceptions, but their performance has not changed the aggregate data much. It's not changed the overall data much. And their story really needs to become typical for us to achieve a future that's consistent with the future that C.K. Prahalad set us, of being a developed India and a developed India around innovation, around multinationals of Indian origin, and so on. So what I'm going to do is to take you through some tables. Do you all have a handout with you? This is, sometimes I pretend that I still teach. So if you all have a handout with you, I'm going to take you through some of these tables. Now, I have to say that when we sent over the tables, my colleague who sent them over decided that it would be much cleaner and neater if you removed the numbers on the tables. So I'm going to have to tell you the title of the table as a way of referring to it. So let me start with some data, and I'll then use this data to try and construct a picture, and then make that proposition that I mentioned earlier on. So, I thought if everyone has their own handouts, they can just look at the handout instead of the slide. Yeah? So R&D is hugely concentrated worldwide. The top 5 countries in R&D account for, don't look for this in the tables yet. So I'll tell you when to look. The top 5 countries account for 2/3 of all the R&D done in the world. About $1.5 trillion of R&D is done in the world. And 2/3 of that is done by just 5 countries. The US, China, Germany, Japan, Germany, and France, in that order. Yeah. Industrial R&D is about 70% of the total R&D. So R&D done within firms is about 70% of the total. The balance is done between universities and in public research laboratories. A few companies demonstrate the concentration of R&D worldwide. The top 20 companies, so just 20 companies worldwide, account for over 20% of total global industrial R&D. Right, so just 20 companies. The top 300 companies account for about 70% of total industrial R&D. So R&D, again, is a hugely concentrated business, and I'm going to use some of this data to sort of paint this picture of why I'm arguing that the Indian innovation system hasn't changed and needs to if we want the kind of future that we all want for us as a country. Now, I'm going to start taking you through some of the tables. So if you look at R&D in India versus other industrializing countries, that should be your that first table, which says R&D as a percentage of GDP over time. And if you look at the India numbers, it will show you that over the last essentially 35 years, the percentage of GDP that we invest in R&D has varied between about 0.6 and 0.9%. So it's risen a bit in recent years, but it's risen very, very modestly. If you look in particular at 1992 and compare it with 2014, it's risen from about 0.7% to 0.9%. Set that against a few other countries. Set that against China, which in 1992 was about the same as India, a little less, 0.6% of GDP. Today, China is about 2.1% of GDP. Right? If you look at China's GDP, China's total GDP today is about 4.5 times India's GDP today in nominal terms. And as a result, China today spends a little over 10 times as much on R&D as we do. Right? If you compare then, look at the next slide, the next table, which is who does the R&D. Right? This tells you again, out of about $1.5 trillion of R&D done worldwide, as I was mentioning earlier, 70% done by firms, and about 12% by public research institutes, 17% by universities. Right? So if you look at who does the R&D, right? Now consider the India numbers. So 35% of total national Indian R&D is done in firms. If you look at the China number, 77% of total Chinese R&D is done in firms. If you add all that up, it says that today Chinese firms between them invest over 20 times the amount in R&D that Indian firms totally do. Yeah? 20 times, right? That's a very huge gap. If you look at Korean firms, I mean, we consider Korea to be this relatively small country. Korean firms invest 6 times as much in R&D as all Indian firms put together. German firms invest 12 times as much in R&D as all Indian firms put together. Right? So we have a huge gap to fill if we really wish to be equal players in global innovation. And these numbers then say that our challenge in R&D is a threefold challenge. First, our share of total GDP that we invest in R&D is relatively low, at 0.9% of GDP. That 0.9% needs to be significantly higher. As we said, China's is over 2%, Korea today is at about 4%, and so on and so forth. Right? So first we have to increase our total investment in R&D. Second, we have to grow the share of total R&D that's done within the corporate sector, that's done within firms. If you look again at that same table, you'll see that the Indian share at 35% is the lowest of all of the countries in the table. So if you look at all the big R&D countries worldwide, the Indian share, okay, someone's nicely changing this slide for me while I talk, good. So the Indian share of R&D, right, is at 35%. Compare that with most countries which have a total global R&D share in the corporate sector that is closer to 2/3, closer to between 60 and 80% typically. Okay? And the third feature of this is the very low share of R&D that in our country is done within higher education, done within the university sector. At 4%, by far the lowest of any country there. China's second at 7%. But if you look at the typical number runs between 15 and 25% for most major economies. Why does that matter? Why does the university share of R&D matter so much? It matters so much because you get dual benefits by doing most public research within the higher education sector. Right? You get two benefits. You get benefits in terms of education, in that you have the output of trained researchers. People come out of your researchers, your future researchers, learn alongside the current best researchers in the country. And in the course of that apprenticeship, as students serve as apprentices, as research assistants in the university system, they learn how to do research. And when they graduate from college, they go to work for companies and they are trained researchers available for companies to do research. So education benefits and research benefits too. Why does research benefit? Well, you don't pay research assistants in college all that much. You give them enough, you give them a living wage, so you cover their costs. So you actually end up doing a lot of basic research in the country at much lower cost than you would if you hired them on commercial terms. This is not a officially pronounced benefit, but it's very real on the ground. Some years ago in the US, I remember reading an article about how the US was arguing that its research system was in crisis. Why? Because the number of students getting PhDs in electrical engineering, the number of American students getting PhDs in electrical engineering was now second to the number of Taiwanese students getting PhDs in electrical engineering. So think about this little island training more PhDs in electrical engineering in the US than the US itself. Yeah? Now you might think, is that a problem actually? Well, as most people pointed out, this was a huge benefit to the US research system because it meant that you had all these very bright people from the rest of the world who were coming and working at very low wage, research assistant stipends, in the system doing the best scientific research around. So huge benefit to a country, one that we should try to tap by really growing the research component in our universities instead of locating research in public research facilities, in autonomous labs. So now, the next question is, why is our corporate share of R&D so low? And that's the next table. So this is industrial R&D by sector for the top 2,500 global R&D spenders. There's an annual survey that's done that says the top 2,500 spenders on R&D worldwide. And this breaks them down by country and industry and all of that sort of stuff. So if you look at this, it tells you that out of the total 2,500 firms, 26 firms are Indian firms, 300 firms are Chinese companies, 80 of the 2,500 are Korean companies, and okay, 800 and some are US companies. Yeah? But just a few things to point out. If you look at where we are present, we have 8 companies present in pharmaceuticals, 6 in automobiles. Right? So not a small number, but still we have a presence in pharmaceuticals and automobiles. And we have a small presence in software as well. And that's about it in terms of industrial sectors where we're present. If you look at the remaining sectors, out of the top 10 global R&D industrial sectors, right, we have no firms in the top 2,500 in 5 sectors and only 1 firm in 2 sectors, right? And the single big reason is that there are some sectors that are R&D intensive worldwide, like technology hardware, like electronic and electrical equipment, like aerospace and defense, like healthcare equipment and services, where we have no firms present. Yeah? So, big reason why there's this missing element of corporate R&D in the country. Okay? Now, let me move on, not to the next slide because I'll try to speed up some. Skip this. Okay, keep that on. Thank you. So, what would transformation look like? If we need to transform our R&D system, right, what would transformation look like? So look at the Korean numbers. The Korean numbers between 1970 and 1990, and the Chinese numbers between 1995 and 2015. And if you look, because that gives us a picture, if you like, if you look at China over the last 20 years, Korea between 1970 and 1990, and India, if you say 2015 through to the next 20 years. Yeah? What would transformation look like? It would look like the Korean 70 to 90 story, and the China 95 to 2015 story. What do you see happening? You see structural change happening, first of all. You see the emergence of whole new sectors. But there's another thing that you see. First, you see a rising share of R&D as a percentage of GDP. From 1970 to 1990 in Korea, a huge increase in that share from 0.35% in 0.4% in 1990 to in 1970 to 1.9% in 1990. The industry share in total R&D is rising from 13% in 1970 to 81% in 1990. And this is at a time when Korean GDP is growing at about 8 to 9% year on year between 1970 and 1990. So you have a rising share of a rising share of a rising GDP, of a rapidly rising GDP. And that gives you a double multiple effect, which then transforms the R&D system in the course of a 20-year period. The same in China. A change in the share of GDP from R&D, a change in the share of industry in total R&D, again with an even more rapidly rising GDP, again giving you the same kind of transformation, which then leads to Chinese firms today spending 20 times what Indian firms spend. Okay, so with that as a construct, let me end by these setting out, if you like, 4 propositions, and then we'll sort of open it up for discussion and questions. And you can look at the remaining tables at your leisure, if it inspires you, you can send me an email and ask questions about them. So the first thing that we have to do in these 4 propositions, it seems to me, is to focus on structural change. We need to worry, yes, about our manufacturing share in GDP. Thank you. Thanks, Taman. But we need to also grow our productivity in services and figure out how to grow our productivity in services. We need to grow in whole new sectors: technology, hardware, aerospace, electrical and electronic manufacturing, healthcare. All those sectors that we talked about earlier where Indian firms are missing today. Second, we need to invest massively more in R&D in our firms. And we have a real opportunity to do so. One of the privileges that we have in the country is the availability of highly talented people at relatively low cost in international terms. And we should use that capability and use that availability of talent to build out our own R&D investments and capabilities. Foreign firms, by the way, recognize this very well. The top 100 R&D spenders worldwide, 83 have R&D centers in India. Right? So 83 of the top 100 R&D spenders worldwide have a significant R&D presence in India. For many of these large firms, for a GE, for a Volkswagen, for a Cummins, there are a set of firms where today their second largest R&D facility worldwide is in India. Yeah. And this creates they recognize the capability of actually building out a very significant presence in R&D from using Indian talent, and we in industry should too. Third, we need to move the public research that we do from the autonomous R&D labs, where most of it, over 90% of public research is done, to the university system. And if we, at least to start with, all incremental funding that we spend on public research should go into higher education and should not go into these autonomous labs. And then fourth, we need to as firms, have the ambition to build out our own international presence. Because as we grow our international presence, we will get feedback from the market, we will get demands of what technology is actually required. Our technology will be tested in these international markets, and we will start, I think, to achieve the vision that C.K. Prahalad had of building out many hundreds of Indian multinationals and firms that can operate worldwide on the basis of technical capability. So let me stop there and then throw it open to questions, and then we can come back and have more discussion. Thank you. So my purpose was not to make everyone feel miserable about where we stand. My purpose was actually to say, we have a huge opportunity here, but making that opportunity come alive is going to require a lot of change. It's going to require change in the public research system. It's going to require change in how we as firms see technology and invest in it, and it's going to require a change in ambition in terms of establishing ourselves internationally.
So not very often do you get a Stanford professor to answer your questions for free. So I don't think you should let the opportunity go by. So open to the house. Anyone wants to ask anything, please raise your hands. Yeah, please go ahead. Depends on.
Sir, you talked about China and Korea and how they sort of, from 1990s to today, how they have kind of changed the entire landscape, the way they do research, fundamental research. The question to you is, what can you learn from them? What have they done differently from 90s to now that has sort of changed the entire landscape? What were the motivations for these companies originating out of China and Korea to invest so much?
So first of all, if I conveyed that the investment by Korean firms and Chinese firms was in fundamental research, that's not actually what they did. What do firms, when firms do innovation and when they invest in R&D, what do they actually invest in? I mean, we would all know this from our own firms. So when you're trying to develop a new product, you're trying to solve a technical problem, how do you go about solving that problem? You don't actually start with research. The first thing you try and do about a problem, you try and solve it on the basis of what you know. If you don't have the answer in your own head, what do? You turn to the person who sits next to you in the office and you ask him or her. Yeah? If they don't know it, then you start asking more widely. If people in the firm don't know it, you ask some other firm. Or you ask your university professor to say, listen, you used to work in this area, can you help me solve this problem? And finally, if all else fails, then you do research, right? So research in that sense is the last resort when one is actually trying to solve a technical problem. It's not the first recourse. Yeah? You do it when everything else no longer happens. So when you see the transformation taking place in Korea from 1970 to 1990, it goes together actually with Korea moving into new fields. So the 1970s is when Korea moves into automobiles in a significant way, for example, into electrical and equipment and technology hardware manufacturing. The move into those fields where they start supplying products to international markets starts flowing back in terms of, okay, we need to do new designs, we need to come up with something that's better, let's do reverse engineering, that's all R&D. Right? You take something apart that's been done already and you try and do it better. Yeah. The same in China, where you really see, by the way, Korean R&D taking off post-1990 is when they start getting into semiconductors. And that's when you really see R&D spending take off. To the point, by the way, where the Korean company Samsung
today spends about the same on R&D as total Indian spending on R&D, at about $17 billion. You take the Chinese company Huawei that does routers, and Huawei spends as much on R&D as total industrial R&D spending in India, at about $7 billion. Right? So these are big numbers by individual firms, and it starts generally with them doing very boring routine stuff, and then they keep getting more and more sophisticated, and they keep placing more and more demands on R&D. And as they place more and more demands in the problems they're trying to solve, they start drawing in more R&D from the public research system as well, and from the university system. So you end up with much more public research and much more fundamental research. You don't start there.
So, Naushad, would it be fair to say that one of the reasons why this culture hasn't developed in India is because of 2-3 reasons? One is that we really don't know how to get started, in a sense. Even though you know there's a problem, you don't really know how to get started finding solutions. The other being that perhaps the whole cost of actually getting to a solution could be both very high and over a period which is very, very long. And third is that, do you feel that the ecosystem of taxation, etc., does not foster that kind of long-term investment in innovation?
First, so repeat the first one. I got the second one, the third one.
No, I was saying that just it's like the habit, or should I say, it is not in our culture. It's part of the mindset that we look at short-term gain, and this looks like one long process of trying to find something.
So I think, I didn't take you through all the tables, but the last two tables have to do with technology import numbers. And one of the things that you'll see there is that the import of technology has really taken off in the last few years. So imports of technology today are about equal to total R&D spending. So this is 1960 to 1998, and you'll see in 1998 in India, at $200 billion, we were a fraction of, let's say, Brazil or Korea or certainly Japan, but also, but just say of Korea. If you take the slide just before this, please. Thanks. If you look at the payments for technology today in 2014, we've gone from $200 billion in 1998 to just under $5 billion in 2014. So the import of technology has taken off in this period in time. It's one of the sources of that change in the product markets that we spoke of earlier on. Right? Now you may say, well, that's bad. Why are we importing technology instead of investing in R&D? That's not actually importing technology is a very good idea. But investing in R&D in addition to importing technology is an even better idea. Because that's what you see happening in other countries. So look at Korea, right? Imports of technology now are $10 billion a year, right? And if you look at most countries, they import technology on a massive scale, but then you also invest a lot in R&D yourself. And that combination of becoming much more technology intensive is what I'm talking about. Now I think Harsh's questions are perfect questions, right? The first question is, how come? Is this habit, is this culture, is this what? And I think it is. I think that's really what it is. I mean, I think we need more and more models of firms that have made it big through investments in R&D, number one. Number two, if you go around and ask firms in the world, why do you invest in R&D? Their single big reason why they invest in R&D is because they're concerned they'll otherwise be out of business in a few years. Right? That's the single reason. The reason is a threat from the outside. Right? They say if we are not there with something that's current, we won't exist. Right? And so you invest for new products and new markets and so on, but you invest primarily because you want to continue to be in business. Right? I don't think we feel that in the country. Right? We feel secure in our future even without that investment in R&D. And I think that's the first thing to change. That So what would I do for pushing much more R&D? I would open markets even more. So I would open markets even more. I would open markets for consumer goods. I would open markets for cars. I would open markets for auto components. I would open markets for engineering products, and use international competition as a way of providing that same threat that, look, either be an equal player with the world or don't exist. Yeah? And so that one needs to force through a threat from the outside that same investment and consciousness and need to invest in R&D. Second, the point on uncertainty is very well taken. But we have a big advantage in the country. We have the advantage of looking at what other countries and companies in the developed world have done and learning from them. And by learning from them, we do not need to actually invest in the really risky, uncertain stuff. We can simply look at what they've done, and once we know that it works, then we do the same. Yeah? So we can invest in capabilities that enable us to be very efficient, quick followers, and we can invest in design skills that are much less uncertain, where the outcome is really much more known. The final question on taxation, also a great question. What people have found around the world is that tax incentives help because they can actually foster focused attention on investing in R&D. We've had a good tax incentive in the country for the last now, it started for the auto sector and pharmaceuticals, and then it was extended to all industry in general, where for many years now, for about 5-6 years, we've had a weighted deduction of 200% on R&D expenses. That, by the way, in this budget, it's going to start going away. From next year, it becomes 150%, and from 2020, it's supposed to become 100%, right? But if you look at the total number of firms that took advantage of this 200% weighted deduction, it's a few hundred firms. It's not insignificant, but it's a few hundred firms, and you don't see that huge, you don't see that tax incentive showing up as much on the ground. I mean, the finance ministry keeps calculating revenue foregone from the tax incentive. That's fine. But actually, it would have been much nicer if much more revenue had been foregone, because it would be great if thousands of firms had invested huge amounts in R&D as a result of that tax incentive to actually grow their R&D investments. Last comment. The wealthiest and richest firms in the country are not necessarily the big investors in R&D. Look at the numbers that Reliance invests in R&D, 0.3% of turnover. I don't think they have a problem with profitability and capability to invest. Look at the amounts that IT services firms invest in R&D in the country. They are tiny numbers. They are numbers that are less than, that typically are on the order of 1% of profits. These are tiny numbers. So they have the resources. You could say that they don't know how to do it, but no one really worldwide knows how to do it. They figure it out. I mean, I can say when we as a company started investing in R&D quite strongly, we spent the first 5 years learning. I mean, we spent the first 5 years doing projects where nothing came out at the end of the project, but we learned a lot in the process, and then we figured out from that learning how to get a new product to actually come out the door at the end of the process.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Good evening, sir. My name is Natarajan X. Dadasti. Now, in fact, I started out with R&D some 45 years ago. Now, still, I feel the concept in India, in industry, regarding R&D is something like that make and buy option. When R&D is available, probably. There are 3 or 4 constraints which have been there and which still continues to haunt us. One could be fund, the second could be the attitude, third is lack of confidence in our own effort and its outcome. So it will result in a form of risk and all that. So given these conditions or the constraints I mentioned, how to go about it?
Well, You know, in terms of make or buy, and as I mentioned earlier on, one should make and buy, right? One should buy the technology wherever one can, and then invest as well in R&D strongly, because actually, as a result of investing strongly, the technology that one buys will actually end up being that much more powerfully put to use. I'll give you an example. Korea from the 1970s. Korea in the 1970s licensed the technology to make a car. Hyundai did that. Yeah. When they licensed the technology to make a car, what did they do with the cars? They imported several cars. The first thing they did was that they had teams from their R&D disassemble and assemble the same car repeatedly, right? As a kind of practice session, right? Just to learn from that particular process. Right? By the way, if you talk to Tata Motors, they've done the same thing, right? Tata Motors is a very honorable exception in terms of investments in R&D in the country. They're the largest investor in R&D for the last 10 years, really. Yeah? And they have gone about things in exactly the same way, and Mahindras are starting to do the same thing. All of that needs to scale up more. In terms of the lack of confidence, I'm not so sure. I mean, look at the confidence that our firms had when we went abroad and made acquisitions. I mean, it certainly wasn't the lack of confidence that got us to go out and buy companies around the world for billions and billions of dollars. I mean, we had great confidence that we would be able to add value to those companies and turn them into something that would become much more successful. So I think we have the confidence, we just need to aim it at R&D too.
So we'll take just two more questions. Professor Ray.
Sir,
You both ask the questions and then he'll answer.
so one of the areas in which we have made significant progress is the IT sector. And it would be worthwhile to recall that in December 2015, we knocked out US and became the second largest internet user population in the world. But strangely, in spite of all this, we still have to depend on Google for a search engine. We still have to depend on Zuckerberg for our social networking sites. We have not been able to innovate. We have done a lot of incremental innovation, but disruptive innovation has not been there. What do you think is the reason for this, sir? Is it because, as you said, the culture is not there in our country? Or why? Why have we not been able to do disruptive innovation in this sector where we are a formidable force?
Yeah. Last question from you. Yeah. Okay, we'll take one more at the end.
Sir, Asif here once again, and I just wanted to ask you a quick question. According to your opinion, what do you think the role of government would be in order to encourage innovations, research and development in the public sectors? Based on my experiences, I have seen a number of government entities who are specialized in research. They do some kind of product which is only in a prototype and it never sees the end of the line. So what do you think that they can take actions so more and more public research is done at the university level?
One last question at the far end.
So when you spoke about in the context of innovation, it is presumed that you refer to product innovation. But there is another thing called innovation in processes and innovation in the method of doing business, which is a more difficult thing but would give far greater returns. Where would you like to comment on that? And second thing is you spoke about us being the second largest R&D center in respect of various multinational firms. But that may not always be a good thing, because the multinational firms are using us, our cheapest labor, to do cutting edge research. But who owns their wealth? It is Microsoft or SAP or Oracle or Bluetooth or someone, Red Hat. These are the people who own the wealth, who own the product, who own the process at our expense. So would you like to comment on that?
So I'll start with the last question and then work my way back. Yeah. So first of all, it's not at our expense. I mean, these multinational firms are paying people very well to do the R&D for them. The argument that I'm making is not that they shouldn't be allowed to. My argument is that as Indian firms, we should do the same. We should use our talent. We should compete with the multinationals to attract the best talent. And by the way, it's not difficult. When we've tried, as a firm, when we've tried to go and recruit people, you can usually recruit them very easily because the actual R&D work being done sometimes is quite boring because it tends to be quite repetitive, and the person working on the project tends not to see the finished total product. They're doing a component of it. So I think you can usually attract people just from an excitement point of view if you actually have the right kind of content and work that's being done. And that's the argument that I'm making, not that multinationals should not be allowed to take advantage, if you like, of our own lower cost talent. On process innovation, absolutely, depending on the sector. In certain sectors, in the chemical sector and specialty chemicals, even in pharmaceuticals to some extent, there's a lot of process innovation that happens. Some of it counts as R&D. Some of the actual shop floor improvements, this is true worldwide, does not show up in the R&D data, but it's no less innovation for that same reason. So is process innovation important? Absolutely, it's important. R&D has some role to play there, but it's not a complete part of the story. You also need to look much more widely at shop floor innovation and the kinds of improvements that take place on the shop floor. What's the role of government to encourage research and to encourage R&D? The role of government is particularly to ensure that our public research is done in the university system. We have this huge opportunity where we have the opportunity of increasing the total research that's done in the university system by a factor of 20 for no cost. Right? If we simply provide the funds that go to autonomous institutes to the university system. So, I mean, if you want me to be completely crass, what I would do is I'd take the National Physical Laboratories in Delhi and I'd stick it on the University of Delhi campus. Right? You'd actually connect it up with the campus and make it part of the physics department and require every scientist over there to teach and to have students that they have, and not just master's students and PhD students, they have some PhD students now, but to have undergraduate students as well, because that would start building that broader sense of research culture. I do the same with NCL in Pune, I do the same with NML in Jamshedpur. These are all the opportunities that are sitting there waiting for us to take advantage of connecting them with our university system and ensuring that the spending that goes into autonomous labs actually happens on university campuses. That's the single big thing for the government to actually worry about and do. On the IT sector question, I think it's a great question. I don't think it's an issue of culture. I think it's an issue of firm strategy. And I think, I've talked to some firms and asked them for years, why don't you invest in R&D? And the argument usually that you get back is, no, we're investing a lot in R&D. But if you look at the actual numbers, the numbers are tiny relative to international software firms. Tiny, right? Why are they so tiny? So here's the story that I've heard from some firms. Our IT services businesses is indeed just that. It's not just IT, it's IT services. The service model is built around highly qualified technical people. What you're selling is the talent in your technical people and that capability to provide that IT service. So what if firms like Infosys, you talk to Infosys or TCS or Wipro, all of them have tried to set up significant R&D centers. All of them have struggled with one thing and one thing alone. They take some of their best people, put them in these R&D centers. Along comes a really juicy project, which requires just the skill set of someone who's working in the R&D center. It's very difficult to say no and to say, no, I won't have this person work on something that delivers revenue today because he's working on something with, we don't know what the fruits are going to be and when they will come. And so you move the person, you say, okay, just for 6 months you work on this project. Pretty soon, you can go and talk to these companies and all of them will tell you about how they've set up R&D facilities, and after 3 or 4 years they had no R&D facility or had very few people left in it. Then they tried again, and then the same thing happened. And then they tried again, and the same thing happened. So to set up an R&D facility requires that the facility needs to be closely connected to your firm because you don't want it to be an ivory tower. But at the same time, it needs to be separate from the firm. And it needs to be separate enough so that you don't have the rest of the firm poaching on the R&D group. You need to kind of protect it from the rest of the group. How you organize that and organize an effective R&D program and all in companies is a whole separate subject really, and a very interesting subject. But you have to start by saying that that's what you definitely intend to do, and then not let anything come in the way of doing it.
Thank you very much. I think every good thing has to come to an end. Thank you, Naushad Bhai. This was absolutely fantastic. And Professor of Stanford would have spent the whole evening, I think, answering all. So, with these few words on behalf of the CII Suresh Neotia Center, let me extend a very warm thank you to Dr. Naushad Forbes, to Chandrajit Da, and to all of you for being here at the C.K. Prahlad Memorial Lecture.